I thought I'd discuss two important conflicting ideas today. And I say this is because I could write this down, but it's best to talk about it in such a way because I'm developing these thoughts right now and will further write about it. But I think it's best to briefly explain where my ideological conclusions are coming from and what I'm thinking about the future of arts, culture, and world politics. So I first thought I would talk about world history in four phases, or at least in Western history. I think you can get down four phases here to understand. And in my own terms, you can break it down into the natural state, modernity, irony, and hypocriticism in that progressive order from 1, 2, 3, 4. Natural state or natural law, what Rousseau argues, is a state where man is like animal and he's not corrupt by social forces. That it wasn't men influencing other men. Man was one with nature. Man kind of acted like a monkey and did what he had to do in order to survive, in order to adapt to his environment. And life was good. Everything was good. This is what Mother Nature intended to do. It wasn't until men became intellectual, created the written and spoken language, started to create a greater sense of civilization, did man escaped natural state and into something what Rousseau calls corruption. But I have another definition for that. The second step is modernity. And modernity is what we are in today and have been since the 19th century. And modernity is where civilization has grown to the point where there's no going back to natural state, and that humans are, especially in the Western world, individuals, hyper-isolated individuals. They have everything at their fingertips. They can be intellects. There's class structures. There is this kind of interest in an occupation, a job, doing what you want to do in life. And that's most of modernity. And modernity helped make utopian systems become viable, like communism, fascism. Most of capitalism is a byproduct of modernity. And what this means is that we're kind of stuck in this never-ending progressive Promethean city builder tendency, supposedly, until comes irony. And the third step, irony, is something that happened around, I would say, the 1950s and 1960s, and that modernity evolved into a new classification, and that people became hyper-aware that they were in a modern system, that there is this progressive city-building tendency. And it's not that you became anti-modernist, it's that people became critical of even existing. And modernity becomes one of everything. Everyone now can be self-described as a modernist, and no longer is there one grand narrative. Yes, you can criticize the past, but we're now criticizing ourselves to a point that no longer sincerity can be apparent anymore. And because of this, people are ironic, eclectic, self-deprecating, and pretty much skeptical of everything. Anybody has narratives, and everybody's now isolated because of the internet. And the majority of white people who are naturally deracinated and don't have a racial identity think in these terms of irony. And irony, I believe, is the current ruling form, but a variant of modernity. Irony takes the form of postmodernity, although claims to be anti-modernist is actually what it says, postmodernity. And irony also helps instill liberalism in power, and everything like that. So the system we're under right now with internet technology, with white girls, that's called irony. Now we get into the fourth step, which I introduce. So this is something I term hypocriticism, or I called it hypocrisyism, but I think hypocriticism is a good term. So in hypocriticism, what's happening is that instead of the new sincerity movement, like David Foster Wallace argued, where people are going to find sincerity even in the crazy postmodern eclecticism, no, that didn't happen. People will find sincerity, but it will be ultimately anti-modern and anti-liberal by logic when following a hypocritical ways of thinking. That because of the rhizomic nature of postmodernity and confusing, so what's going to happen is you will have weird cases where there are white nationalists that want to kill white people, or black nationalists that rely on white people in order to support black nationalism. That there's something called Asian Aryanism, that you advocate Asian sexuality. And so all these old motifs of deracination whiteness, of keeping white people down, whatever, there's going to be a hypocritical logic which will be advocated by the neoliberal elite, where they believe these are sincere forms without questioning bigger grand narratives, and people will just do things. Like, for example, the new communism will be a communism without white people. It's a hypocritical statement, but yet people will go with it as sincere statements. So what's happening is the irony phase is inverting itself towards truth. And so Joel, at least this different truth logic that people believe, and it's not that there's a big grand narrative, there's this new grand narrative, and there's many grand narratives, and these many grand narratives are all going at war with one another to a point where they'll remake the grand narrative of Back to the City building, or in itself that anti-modernity and anti-liberalism will arise as we see that this so-called pretentious belief leads nowhere, but, weird intersectionalities can happen. Like, I'm a black man, and we must stop whiteness. As a white nationalist who is a black man, we must stop whiteness. That is what I call hypocriticism. And that will be like a new, sincere, anti-liberal, anti-modernist thing. So as I explain those four phases of Western world history, which I should write, these are just me taking notes and figuring out how I'll go about this. I also want to bring about something of the weirdness of hypocriticism or hypocrisyism, that once we have these rhizomic identities happening through irony, that you can't be sincere because of deflating the grand narrative. People will be sincere with something I believe called, the Afro-Asian imitation. So this is like a concept I haven't written about yet, but I'm going to share it for the first time here. So Afro-Asian imitation. So in this science fiction setting, or I say in this reality setting, something Jason Giorgiani would argue, you will have a group of affluent, half-white, half-black women all wanting to be K-pop musicians. And those K-pop record labels hire them as the first black K-pop singers, right? But the truth is they had a white dad and a black mom, but they're singing Korean. How postmodern and rhizomic is that? However, there's going to be this new hypocrisyism where what if that black Afro-Asian K-pop singer has a white fan, and there's a whole Afro-Asian K-pop scene, and these white people, these more further deracinated people, want to emulate the K-pop Afro-Asian scene. And so what happens is those K-pop Afro-Asians will blame the white people trying to emulate them as colonizers or like cultural appropriation. And they'll use the language found in hyper neoliberal circles of the irony thing. And what happens is that K-pop Afro-Asians are so hypocritical, and the whites who emulate them, that we have lost any historical erasure or genealogy which makes sense anymore of the authentic. It's like there is this authenticity, but it's this insanity where both sides are practicing this hypocriticism. The one side is hypocritical because you're an Afro-Asian K-pop star, and the other person is a white person trying to emulate Asian culture, but the Asian culture is not even Asian at all whatsoever, or Korean. And here they are bickering about who's right and who's wrong. But both their logical axioms are hypocritically flawed. And I think this is a great example of hypocrisyism. Now, with this statement, with this little test example, if I was to tell this in front of a class of like undergraduate students or something like that, they would say, there's no such thing as Afro-Asian K-pop stars. You must be crazy. They'll all like snicker and laugh at me. Just like how they'll snicker and laugh at me like I'm a black man or something. But then it's like, if you think about the logic slowly and understand what will happen in the future, there'll definitely be some like weird historical erasure where people will take hypocritical statements sincere. Again, the white nationalist that has to kill whiteness to save the white race. That is the gist of hypocriticism. Or the Asian Aryan. We must save the Eurasian race. And so, back to the Afro-Asian K-pop star. We must save, we must politically protect Afro-Asian K-pop stars. And it's becoming so rhizomic and so crazy that only hypocrisy is sincere. Yes, I believe most of what I'm trying to say in this Hypocriticism 1.0 or Hypocrisy 1.0 ideology draft. I am influenced by the works of Alexander Dugin, Dick Hebdige, Rene Girard, and Erik Erikson. A lot this has to do with mimic desire, subculture, the psychosocial narrative and development. In his way, hypocrisyism is a natural anti-modernist, anti-liberal movement that will confuse so many people. It will no longer be postmodernist or modernist at all, and that ultimately we will go back to this kind of Promethean or city building tendency that isn't so much of modernity, but as well as, I would even say it could be reactionary, and you could translate it that way. But I wouldn't actually say it's reactionary. I would say it's just like it is, anti-modern, anti-liberal, Duginism kind of reaching the queer culture and the arts. So yeah. These notes were recorded on September 21st, 2021. This is Pilliter.